If we take a look at the core of Root, with all of the factions plucked away, you're left with a dry and tasteless game, like having barbecue in Europe. Only about 10% of Root is the actual core rules, and the other 90% is all the faction-specific additions. The base rules are just a canvas for the factions to do their own song and dance. So this leads me to scratch my chin and ponder. If the game is 90% the factions mechanics, isn't the game's quality almost entirely dependent on the quality of the factions and how well they mix together? Yes, my friends, the answer is yes. The ultimate faction tier list. So here's how we're going to do this. We're ranking the 10 released factions under a few different criteria, each also out of 10. Complexity to play. Since each faction is so wildly different, their difficulty to understand and play also matters. Throughout this list, I'll start off with the least complex and work my way up. How much fun is the faction to play? For a game to be good, it has to be fun. And since the vast majority of Root is based on the faction you play, each faction needs to be fun to pilot and to actually play as. How much fun is the faction to play against? Likewise, if you want good interaction, your enemies need to be fun to fight, and not just a furball of frustration. How strong is the faction? There's a pretty hefty competitive scene on Tabletop Simulator and a bit over the online digital adaptation. So power levels matter, and especially for those who want to take the game more seriously, it is important to know how they rank up next to each other. Also, it's nice to know you have agency and can actually impact a game. The overall quality. Most important, the overall vibe of the faction and how all the elements mesh together for how good the faction really is for the game as a whole. Great, I hope that all makes sense. Let's go. Starting off, we got the Marquise de Cat with a complexity of 1 out of 10, a fun to play factor of 7 out of 10, fun to fight 10 out of 10, and a strength of 3 out of 10. The overall quality is 7 out of 10. Okay, so the Cats are the most basic and simple faction. You know the type. Generic Space Marines, but in feminine cat form. You can implement any RTS knowledge that you might have, and for the most part, it will translate to the Marquise de Cat. They start off with a huge board presence as they represent the current rulers. If they can maintain their control of their network, they will be able to create an industrial haven, like Nestle and our water supply. The Cats industrialize the forest for their gain. To score points, you need to build, and each building serves a unique purpose. The sawmill makes wood, the workshop lets you craft, the recruiter lets you get more troops. Then there are actions you can take, but all of them are basic and easily resolved. Even though they're as basic as Bleach, the Cats are still enjoyable to operate. They have a similar vibe to Ryu in Street Fighter or the Terran in StarCraft. They feel like they operate with the base mechanics in the most logical way and reward an understanding of the fundamentals, like rule and basic actions of movement and fighting. So yeah, super easy to play and understand, so they get a 1 out of 10 for complexity. Likewise, the logistic lines of wood can give great glee and present a fun little optimization puzzle to spread your labor camps. The Cats are reliant on bird cards to gain extra actions, so some games can feel less active than others depending on draws, but overall they still feel fun game after game. So a 7 out of 10 for fun to play is pretty reasonable. Now, I love seeing Cats in my games because their initial setup creates the best counterbalance to all the other factions. They always feel threatening, but due to their limited action economy, it's rare for Cats to attack immediately. They create points of tension throughout the board without feeling overwhelming. It's honest to play against them, and they alter the board state in a very healthy way for the game. They have good presence and clear weaknesses that can be strategized around, which is perfect for the other players. So they're an easy 10 out of 10 to play against. That said, from a strength perspective, Cats are weaker than average. They suffer from an almost there syndrome, where they can get to about 20 points consistently, but then they just kind of crash due to their wood transport system falling apart. They're the weakest of the militant factions, but they aren't the weakest faction in the game. So they're ranked 3 out of 10 in terms of strength. Still, the Cats get a 7 out of 10 for overall quality. They represent the standard for what to expect from the game and really just add a lot of good to any match. While they're a tiny bit boring compared to the insanity later on, they can still be a fun little puzzle while presenting a good entry point into Root. Overall, a healthy, fun addition to the game that can sometimes feel a bit weak, but that's alright, you know? The Eerie Dynasties, with a complexity of 2 out of 10, a fun to play of 10 out of 10, a fun to fight also 10 out of 10, a strength of 8 out of 10, and an overall quality of 10 out of 10. The Eerie are a group of 4 bird dudes who are trying their best to recover from complete failure. Like a bunch of tech bros, these 4 leaders like to program. Each has their own ability and loyal vizier that sets the pace for that plan. They then program a list of commands called a decree, and if the decree is failed, that leader puts the kingdom into turmoil and is then disposed of, and a new leader replaces them. The Eerie perfectly demonstrates the simple to play, hard to master game design. For new players, the idea of programming a decree and then following what needs to be done is very approachable and rewarding. It's like a flowchart, so they get a 2 out of 10 for complexity. For experienced players, pulling off a stacked decree is a ton of fun and gives that Yu-Gi-Oh! Millennium Eye foresight. The decree mechanic is really quite brilliant because it gives an excuse for players to actually be aggressive and expand without making it feel personal. And the mechanics of the Eerie tickle the brain in all the right places and are logically presented so people can catch on really quickly. The Eerie are both extremely fun to play and to fight because you know what's in that decree, you know what's incoming, and you know what you can play around. As an enemy to the Eerie, you can perfectly sabotage a decree with a single well thought out attack. But the decree as a mechanic is still powerful, and it's a tool that keeps the Eerie extremely competitive. They act as an expanded force that starts off huddled and localized in one clearing, but grow an ability to spread quickly. As the pilot, playing the Eerie has a constant sense of being on the knife's edge. With your decree and fulfilling a huge decree is a great step forward to victory. While for opponents, having to deal with every single approaching force can add to a healthy tension because you can then predict and interrupt their plans through sabotaging their decree. So 10 out of 10 to play as and to fight against. The Eerie are often considered one of the most powerful factions in the game and a top pick in the tournament scene. The only real blemish I feel from the Eerie is that most games start off with the charismatic leader for that sweet troop advantage, and the builder leader is rarely used. But overall, it's a minor critique of an overall stellar display of game design. The Eerie are super solid, and if every faction was this good, I would be dying to play Root every single day until my bones are cooked. So 10 out of 10 for the overall quality for the Eerie. The Corvid Conspiracy, with a complexity of 3 out of 10, fun to play 4 out of 10, fun to fight 5 out of 10, a strength of 1 out of 10, and an overall quality of 4 out of 10. Next up, we have the other birds, the Corvid Conspiracy. The Corvid are an underground network of slippery spies who can plant little plots that can be flipped and revealed for their gain. They can pop up across the board and are in general little agents of chaos. Now, these sneaky birds are surprisingly intuitive to play. The concept of converting troops into undercover plots and then given the signal to activate them makes perfect sense and is thematically strong. To make life a bit easier, they have the nimble ability where they can move around clearings without concern for rule, which I find is very helpful for newer players. Simply put, the crows need to reveal their plots, and as they reveal, they accelerate their points. So the really only difficult part is knowing what each 4 plot does, so they get a 3 out of 10 for complexity. Playing as the Corvid though does feel frustrating. Their main mechanism of scoring is very easy to disrupt and ruins the flow of their points. Many other factions tend to ramp up naturally as the game progresses, and the Corvid ramp based off how many plots are already on the board. The thing is, it's very easy for enemies to just go and destroy these plots, or even worse, expose the plots before they even go off. Yeah, it's a blast when you can get that perfect bomb off, but it's often easy to predict because there can only be a maximum of 2 of each plot in play. Worst case, plots can be exposed via multiple enemies attempting multiple exposure actions, which is a minimal sacrifice if it means that the Corvid are out of contention of the game. There is a counter raid token that rewards the crows if the token is removed, except when it's exposed, but even that doesn't really do much, because if they can't convert those new birds into effective plots, it becomes uneventful. In a way, the whole raid token is cyclic. The crow becomes a raid token, then it gets attacked and removed, and then more crows come, and then those crows become more raid tokens. Sure, there's a lot of crows, but they don't really necessarily translate to points if they all get exposed by other players. This is especially frustrating when the crows feel so limited on their action economy, and to squeeze out more actions, you need to reduce your card draw. I've seen interesting openings where players start with a raid token to get revealed as soon as possible so that the point scoring is accelerated, while also creating a deterrent to attacking that one token. Or even players who put tokens completely randomly, which in a way is to recognize that the effects are less important than the points generated, but nothing really seems to be a great way to ease the frustrations of playing as the Corvid. So yeah, it's not great for either side. The Crows aren't that fun to play as, and they aren't that fun to fight. So 4 out of 10 to play as and 5 out of 10 to play against. For a faction all about plotting and schemes, they're kind of boring, but if someone is really interested in playing a sneaky faction, I guess they fit the fantasy, but they don't really excel in what could have been. From a strength perspective, the Crows are often considered the weakest faction in the whole game. There are just too many things working against them. The risk of exposure is too high, and their abilities like Nimble and Embedded Agents aren't enough to dissuade people from attacking them and ruining their game. They don't feel like they have much control, or they don't gain much power throughout a single game, and winning with them will often just feel like you weren't even considered in the first place. So yeah, the Crow dudes, they get a 1 out of 10 for strength. Now, one interesting buff I saw during the 2023 tournament scene is that the Crows can have 3 of each plot instead of 2. This is actually super good because now you can have 2 of each plot face up and people still need to guess between 4 total plot types. Even better is that the physical game actually comes with 3 of each plot token anyways, because the people at Letter Games thought it might be a good idea in case 1 or 2 get scuffed. So it's a fun buff for the Crows, and it's actually resulted in the Crows having a huge win rate increase in the tournament. So let's go Letter Games, make it official, right? Overall, I don't hate the Crows, I just feel like they could have been more. Small changes would go a long way, but for right now, with the rules as written, the Corvid are a 4 out of 10 for quality. The Vagabond, with a complexity of 4 out of 10, a fun to play as a question mark out of 10, a fun to fight a 1 out of 10, and a strength of 10 out of 10. The overall quality of the Vagabond is a 1 out of 10. The Vagabond. These 9 little hot messes are the most divisive faction in the game. Since the Vagabond is the man with no name-esque RPG character who helps and hinders those that they wish, they are a versatile and very powerful faction, and very uncouth. So let's get started, shall we? Learning the Vagabond as a concept is fairly easy, but the execution can be tricky because they have so many exceptions. It's easy to understand that each item is connected to a different action. Boots for movements, swords for attacking, root tea for refreshing items, hammers to craft and repair, tissues for all your whiny enemies. It's all fairly easy to grasp conceptually. The problem comes with the exceptions. For example, when you move into a territory with a hostile faction, it takes 2 boots. Or what happens when you get trapped in a revolted space? What about a mob raise? It can be a little hard to know what to do when effects only explicitly refer to troops, buildings, and tokens, but not to the singular Vagabond. That said, conceptually the Vagabond is still approachable. It's the exceptions that toss people into the law of root. So still, they get a 4 out of 10 for complexity. Now a whole nother discussion is needed when it comes to the Vagabond fun levels. The fun really does stop here, and it's not a good time for anyone. I can do a 90-minute video on why the Vagabond is bad game design, but let's get into it. First, the Vagabond offers no reward for the player who takes the sacrifice to attack them. Every other faction has tokens that will be able to be removed to score some bonus points, but the Vagabond does not reward the player who hits them, but just hinders the Vagabond and reduces the action economy of the player who does it. It's like a really garbage prisoner dilemma, because everyone doesn't want to hit the Vagabond, but someone has to, otherwise the Vagabond will spiral out of control. Second, even if you want to stop the Vagabond, it's one piece in one clearing that can move freely. Even if you want to hit them, you might just not be able to hit them, which is not a problem that other factions have because every other faction tends to be in multiple spaces at any given time, which increases the opportunities for counterplay and interaction, which the Vagabond lacks. There's just a general lack of interaction with the Vagabond from the perspective of other players. Third, let's say you have a table that's all actually down to attack the Vagabond. Then the Vagabond has to go into the forest and just skip out on turns constantly, which isn't fun for them either. But then their progress isn't really hindered as they come out good as new, so trying to stop the Vagabond and recovering as the Vagabond is unfun for both sides. Fourth, Vagabonds are the strongest kingmakers in a game of kingmaking. If they aid one player and attack another player, it's so awfully one-sided, and Vagabonds are actually encouraged to help one player to get to their ally status. And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with Kingmaking, but this gameplay from the very start is not fun for the table. And the Vagabond encourages making kings with one player to get them to that ally mechanic. 4.5. Coalitions, just coalitions. They are counter to what dominance cards should be, which is a risky gambit to turn the tides. But instead, they're a safety net to hop on someone else's back as a Vagabond. Since coalitions are made with the player in last place, the Vagabond could potentially aid them enough to accelerate whatever engine they're building. For example, the Woodland Alliance are incredibly bursty and tend to lag behind until the end game, so they benefit tremendously from the Vagabond becoming a coalition with them. 5th, with the base game deck, some of the crafting options just feel busted, especially with the Tinker Vagabond. So almost everyone who plays Root will just use the Exiles and Partisans deck as effects. The 6th point, oh my god, they keep going. Once decked out with items, it is common strategy just to come out of the forest and swing as hard as possible since they score off troop kills, which means they can get 7, 8, 9 points in just a few combat actions, where other factions would only get points for buildings and tokens that are destroyed. Now, these problems are minimal in a vacuum, but when you blend it all together and put all of this bad game design into one little pawn, it's just a bad experience for everyone involved. Games without the Vagabond are significantly better, and it's just the sad reality of it all. Even the competitive scene uses a modified rule to reduce scoring off troops called Despot Infamy, which only lets them score off the first troop killed in a combat, which even the creator of the game endorses. Anyways, for all of this, I'm putting the Vagabond as a question mark to fun to play as. Some people love playing as this little Havoc Destroyer, Chaos Man. Other people can't stand it. I just find it so uncool, so I don't understand how people can like these Vagabonds. On the other hand, playing against the Vagabond is objectively awful. 1 out of 10. Every single other faction is better to have on the table, no question asked. Again, Root is noticeably a better game without the Vagabond. Seriously. That said, they're also the most powerful faction in the game, so they get a 10 out of 10 for strength. So yeah, people still play Vagabonds because they're just so dang powerful, and if winning is important, they're your best bet. The Vagabond is kind of like a guy at a party who hasn't showered in 3 weeks and gorges on all of the food, spits in the punch bowl as a joke, but happens to be the dean's son, so everyone pretends to like his company. It's awful. Overall quality is 1 out of 10. The Underground Duchy, with a complexity of 5 out of 10, a fun to play as 7 out of 10, fun to fight 3 out of 10, a strength of 9 out of 10, and an overall quality of 5 out of 10. Okay, thank God, the Duchy. The Duchy are extremely strong. They're muscle boys who get swollen the burrow, and they have this great power fantasy, but it can be frustrating to deal with their various strategies, since it all feels very overwhelming. I'm happy for them though. Relative to the nightmare that is the Vagabond, these moles are much improved. They have a little kingdom with barons and earls that can be swayed into the fight against other woodland critters, and they like to build markets for card draw, or citadels for more troops, or tunnels for sneaky movement. Plus they have the burrow, a secret hole with jacked little mole meeples. The Duchy are still reasonable for a new player to approach. They have a nice flow to them, and really only the idea of swaying ministers is a little tricky because of the criteria of needing to have cards in your hand and pieces on the board in a matching clearing. It's still easy enough with a guide in hand, but it will take a few rounds before it all clicks together. They have a lot of viable options, and each one feels good to interact with. So a complexity of 5 out of 10. They're just about bordering a complex faction, but once swaying ministers clicks, they're very reasonable. The Duchy also have this very nice rhythm of play. They have a safety to them with the burrow since it's immune from other players, and a nice feeling of leveling up as you sway more ministers. In a way, it kind of imitates the Decree, as you gain power, but you can lose it all if you're not careful. You gain actions by building up your swayed ministers, and in later stages of the game, you can score huge points through their activation. There are a lot of different strategies, some involve in building citadels or markets and then go into turtle and protect those places, while other strategies involve no buildings at all, so you can never really pay the price of failure. They're very flexible and strong, with a ton of good options. I especially enjoy how the community has named their strategies, like Small, Swull, Mole Mart, Small to Swull, and it's all good fun, so they get a 7 out of 10 for enjoyability to play. On the other hand, to fight against them can be very frustrating because they are so strong they need a lot of policing before they spiral into a bunch of jacked blind moles who can just pop out and destroy anything. The Brigadier Minister is so strong and provides so much value that it really does feel kind of busted. All of this leads to a gameplay style that has spiral and action economies that makes the moles feel uncontrollable if left to their own devices. The mechanism to slow down these moles is to destroy one of their buildings to get them to pay the price of failure and lose that steam. But to counter this, some mole strategies involve no buildings at all. It's almost comical. It's like the moles huddled together and said, we can only be slowed down if a building falls. So let's agree never to build any buildings. And somehow this strategy works. Truthfully, they're overtuned and are the strongest faction overall, except for the Vagabond. Fighting them feels more frustrating than any other strong faction, even like the Eyrie. So they get a 3 out of 10 for fighting against them, and a 9 out of 10 from a strength perspective. The moles are a 5 out of 10 from a game design quality perspective. They are a standout when it comes to the sheer strength and flexibility of that faction, but they aren't really fun to play against, which really just docks a ton of points from their design. They would benefit from a redo of a few of their ministers, especially the Brigadier, and there should be more ways to encourage them to actually build so that they can pay that price of failure. They are strong, they can be fun to play, but since they have so much frustrating elements to play against, I just can't say that they're a well-designed faction. Lord of the Hundreds, with a complexity of 6 out of 10, a fun to play of 9 out of 10, a fun to fight as 9 out of 10, a strength of 5 out of 10, and an overall quality of 9 out of 10. Okay, the Lord of the Hundreds are up next in terms of complexity, and we've had a couple duds, so we're back to some colossal brain design. The incredibly moody rats are a boisterous, aggressive, and clever example of how a faction can work. They sit at 6 out of 10 for complexity because they have a few interlocking mechanics, like the mob tokens, the warlord meeple, their mood cards, and their unique use of items. I've encountered a ton of choice paralysis from new players when deciding what mood to put their rat warlord as, and it spirals from there into a bunch of decisions that can often be hard to link together. But the rats are the border between medium and high complexity factions. The complexity of the rats can be explained through thematics. For example, if a mob exists long enough, it will destroy everything and steal all the items hidden in the ruins to give back to the rat warlord's horde, which then allows for more actions, but also limits what mood he can be in. Or how the Hundreds score by completely oppressing a clearing, which is to only have their pieces in the clearing as they watch the rest of the forest collapse. The rats are fast, aggressive, and have a lot of influence on what happens on the board. Thankfully, they don't feel overwhelmingly strong due to their criteria to score requires complete domination of a clearing. The faction presents a lot of player decisions and has a nice flow of inciting mobs and growing in power from the wealth of the horde and the increase in size of their army. Plus, the idea of a unique, singular piece in an army is novel, but doesn't feel overpowered or fundamentally broken. It's just fun and different. So yeah, easy 9 out of 10 fun to play as. Likewise, playing against the Hundreds presents a clear pathway for interaction. They have a need to constantly move, destroy, and occupy, so finding chokeholds as another militant faction is key to counter them. Or if you're playing as an insurgent faction, using the unique spawning methods to sneak and take over poorly defended Hundreds clearings presents clear counterplay to their strategy. Their card draw is also abysmal, and their build-in action takes from both card economy and action economy, which makes it especially painful to have those buildings destroyed. They have a lot of board impact, and they do feel like a moving horde that decimates everything in its path, and playing against this style is actually very enjoyable without ever feeling awful. So yeah, they get a 9 out of 10 to play against. The Hundreds are also a fairly balanced faction, right in the middle of our list at 5 out of 10 strength. They have clear weaknesses, and a fairly predictable overarching strategy does limit their path of destruction, but their unique powers can keep them as a powerful policing force. They can move fast, hit hard, but leave vulnerabilities if they don't play carefully. I don't find them weak at all, but I don't find them overwhelmingly OP. So a nice 5 out of 10 in terms of strength relative to all other factions. Overall, the Rats are an excellent faction with clear strengths, weaknesses, and flavorful decision space. It's a success in game design that flies to the top of what Root has to offer. So 9 out of 10 for overall design quality. The Woodland Alliance. With a complexity of 7, a fun to play as 6 out of 10, a fun to fight 5 out of 10, a strength of 6 out of 10, and overall quality 6 out of 10. The Woodland Alliance is the local foxes, rabbits, and mice of the forest clearings uniting against the tyranny of the other invading factions. These little buddies play much more like a nice little Euro game than a war game. Since the Woodland Alliance works by rousing up supporters from their local clearing, they need to have cards in their supporter deck of that corresponding clearing. These supporters can be rallied up and turned into sympathizers, who then with enough support can be transformed into military bases through a revolt. Then, through the night, these bases act as the military operations hub to further spread support and attack usurpers. So, if all of that sounds a bit confusing, it's fair, because the Woodland Alliance from a conceptual standpoint can be a bit intimidating. They don't start off with any of their funny little toast soldiers on the board, and their first few rounds can be infuriating as it feels like no progress is made. That said, they have the highest burst potential, and it isn't unusual for a well-positioned Woodland Alliance player to win the game from 18 or so points. Their strength is shrouded in confusion until you really learn how to operate them and how they're able to transform various resources into sympathy, which just skyrockets them into a point lead. So yeah, these little buddies get a 7 out of 10 for complexity. From a fun to play perspective, they're a little odd. Some players love the concept of gathering sympathy and spreading as an elusive force. Others enjoy the nighttime military operations, and the strength of their units is higher than everyone else through their guerrilla warfare trait. They do feel slightly limited as they have the fewest amount of soldier tokens, and that actually does decide their action economy. That said, the Woodland Alliance is especially reliant on how other players react to their presence. Having them in a game seems to centralize the 3 other players into a strategy of maintaining the spread of sympathy by placing troops strategically in areas of future spread. This is done by utilizing the martial law aspect of the Woodland Alliance, resulting in more resources required to actually make progress as a Woodland. Often, trying to quash these sympathy tokens only result in more sympathizers, and can result in slowing down your own progress and accelerating the Woodland Alliance. The thing is, it isn't really that fun to play as or against the Woodland Alliance. There are games where the player doesn't have much agency, and they can feel like there's only one path forward while playing as the Alliance. On the other hand, playing against the Alliance can be frustrating due to your stronger battle mechanics and your constant loss of cards. Sometimes when you're playing against the Woodland Alliance, the best strategy is just to sit a whole bunch of your own troops in a base spot, which allows you to take over the rule and then nullify the ability for them to organize further, simply because their troops can't move out anymore. So I'm giving them a fun to play as a 6 out of 10 and a fun to fight against a 5 out of 10. That said, the Woodland Alliance is still strong. They have a ton of burst potential and can really swing games hard if the gold path arises. They require active involvement to stop and can feel like a freight train of sympathy if you don't get the proper blockades in. They are a strong faction from a competitive standpoint and can often centralize a game around their sympathizers and bases. Enemies of the Woodland Alliance will know that if the stars align, these little buddies can get so many points in a single turn and close out a game, which gives them a 6 out of 10 in terms of strength. Overall though, the Woodland Alliance is an okay-ish designed faction with strengths, weaknesses, and a unique playstyle. It just isn't as magical as a lot of other factions, and sometimes the path to victory is so singular, you'll feel like there's only one viable playstyle. People at the table will need to address the huge burst of points once you get established, so there's a lot of good and a lot of bad with them, so I'm giving them a 6 out of 10 for quality. Next up, we have the Riverfolk Company, with a complexity of 8 out of 10, a fun to play as 7 out of 10, a fun to fight against 7 out of 10, a total strength of 7 out of 10, and an overall quality also 7 out of 10. The Riverfolk Company is the most group dependent of all the factions in Root. Different group metas and approaches to the game will dramatically change how these merchants of war perform. The complexity of this faction isn't inherently from their own actions. While they do have a lot of nuance, such as their dividends or their alternate crafting options, and how trade posts are slightly different than other build-ins, their main source of complexity comes really from knowing how other factions can use their services and thus continue to move their economy of actions. For example, knowing that a Vagabond will always refresh 3 items, even at their very first turn, means that an Otter player can price a card for them right away at 3, and there is no real cost to the Vagabond. The Otters require a lot of game knowledge, and a lot of their action economy is tied to a unique resource that isn't always available. So 8 out of 10 for complexity. Also, since the Otters have a hard cap of 18 points through their trade-in post, the Riverfolk Company will need to find 12 more points either through crafting, dividends, or destruction, which leads to a lot of playstyle diversities. Some Otters are very protective of their trade post and will try to get a few dividends in and then will rapidly expand. Other Otters will set on a warpath and destroy vulnerable buildings through superior movement abilities. And playing as the Otters can be very rewarding, fun, and a social experience that creates new dynamics over the table that aren't implemented normally in Root. The tangible exchange of services for actions, or the open hand, or the unique movement options, all presents a ton of space for creative play. But there are frustrating moments when people will just ignore your services, so they get a 7 out of 10 for fun to play. Likewise, playing against the Riverfolk Company can be fun and rewarding as well. The Riverfolk Company presents a good prisoner dilemma, which is unlike the Vagabond. Because if you are the sole purchaser of their goods, you'll gain a significant advantage without overly funding the Riverfolk action economy. But if everyone purchases from the Riverfolk can easily spiral into infinite wealth and become merchants who trade in death. It's a fine line of trying to gain an advantage without creating the utterly unstoppable Otter merchants of death. If the Otters ever become oppressive, it's at least partly to blame on everyone else, which is a pretty good game dynamic in my opinion, so they get a 7 out of 10 to play against. Now, the Riverfolk aren't perfect. The biggest problem is that because the Otters are so dependent on sales of their goods, if the table just agrees not to purchase from them, the Otters are crippled and will have no impact on the game. Unlike any other faction, they will be eliminated from victory without a single battle. And this can easily happen if the opponents are not swayed by the Otters' players' services. That said, the Otters do provide real benefits to those who know what to buy from them, and this dilemma between players can often result in the Otters spiraling into a very powerful faction. So they get a 7 out of 10 for strength. Overall, what these little buddies offer is unique and clever and healthy for the game, but their reliance on other players is a cursed blade that can really change the entire vibe of a game. So they get a 7 out of 10 for overall faction quality. Next up, we have the Lizard Cult, with a complexity of 9 out of 10, a fun to play as 10 out of 10, a fun to fight 7 out of 10, a strength of 2 out of 10, and an overall quality of 8 out of 10. The lizards are goofy little cultists. They have stupid little meeples that are adorable and perfectly match the vibe of playing them. They're funny, they're a little inept, but dang, they're a lot of fun. Playing the lizards are really more akin to a card game. Their entire suite of actions is dependent on card draw, and since they hate birds, bird cards are used to create a unique resource called acolytes, which allow for excellent shenanigans. Since they have a heavy reliance on what cards they draw and what other players discard, there is a higher level of RNG than other factions, which can feel restricting. The whole approach to the Lizard Cult is completely different than any other faction, and they really don't share many similarities between their actions. To wrap your head around them will take real effort and a willingness to relearn core concepts of Root, which makes them one of the more complicated factions in the game. 9 out of 10 for complexity. That said, the Lizard Cult is a very fun, very wacky faction that captures the spirit of a dysfunctional cult. Just the idea that when your troops die on the board, they become acolytes, which further convert and sanctify enemy pieces. It's a lot of fun, and they have a lot of playstyle expression. Their design results in a good balance of messing with enemy pieces while building their own gardens using the cards to act in neat ways. They're an easy 10 out of 10 for fun. From the opponent's perspective, the lizards are also pretty nice as well. They can feel powerful when an outcast becomes hated, and they can really go ham with those acolytes, but other players will have direct control of what clearing becomes the outcast, and can be countered through clever use of cards. Even when the stars align and the lizards go hard, they never feel that frustrating because it takes a lot of work to make them win. So they get a 7 out of 10 to play against. Which leads me to my next point. The lizard cult is also one of the weakest factions in the game. Their wins are rare, and overall the power level is kind of tepid. They feel easy to sabotage if their gardens aren't properly protected, and the reliance on card draw kind of makes or breaks the lizards from a competitive standpoint. It's kind of on brand though, because you gotta pray to the deck and hope you get some cards to score off those gardens. So they get a 2 out of 10 for power level. Still, they're fun for everyone. They're different than all the other factions, and they can keep things interesting. So a very solidly designed faction overall. I gotta give these goofy boys an 8 out of 10. Last up, we got the Keepers in Iron, with a complexity of 10 out of 10, fun to play 8 out of 10, fun to fight 8 out of 10, a total strength of 4 out of 10, and an overall quality of 8 out of 10. Okay, last of all, we have the Jacked Keepers in Iron. These buff knights want to collect little relics around the forest and bring them back to their way stations to score big points. They share a similar core gameplay mechanic with the Eyrie, but instead of suffering through turmoil, these badgers use a retinue that allows for certain actions, but the actions are not mandatory. That said, you can still lose your retinue cards if you don't rule enough adjacent clearings when you delve for relics, or when you actually try to recover these relics, you need to have ownership of matching clearings. When you first learn these Keepers in Iron, it's a bit of a mess, because their puzzle is a lot harder to conceptually understand than other factions. For the Eyrie, you gotta build Roost. For the Lord of the Hundreds, you gotta press clearings. For the Crows, you need to reveal plots. All of these other factions have simple game loops that actually encourage these scoring mechanisms. But for the Badgers, the idea of taking relics from the forest, which is already rarely interacted with, and then moving them back to a way station to score can be confusing for first-time players. Along with that, adding cards to the retinue is a puzzle in itself, because you can add as many as you want at the end of your turn, and it's really a key place of skill expression. So they get a 10 out of 10 for complexity, as they are the most complex faction in the game. That said, after a few games, the Badgers are extremely fun to play, and extremely enjoyable to optimize and strategize with. I love trying to figure out what micro adjustments can be made to solve their relic collecting puzzles, and some things I've learned is usually best to make 2 way stations right away, as well as to add 2 or 3 cards if you're feeling frisky to your retinue and work your way up to 10 cards. The Badgers are constantly moving and recovering back to their way stations, so expect to have a lot of moving parts, and juggling all of these parts can be extremely rewarding and fun, while also having a ton of skill expression, so they get an 8 out of 10 for fun to play as. From an opponent's perspective, the Keepers in Iron are pretty dang good to fight as well. They have a lot of counterbalances built in. For example, while their Devout Knights can block the first hit in combat, they are good targets because if they lose their precious relic token, the opponent will score 2 points instead of 1. These knights also live off the land, so they can't really stack an army very efficiently. It's all very flavorful, but gives opportunities to counterbalance through decisive plays from opponents. So they also get an 8 out of 10 to play against. Now, for probably my most controversial opinion of this list, but I don't find the Keepers in Iron very powerful. Sure, they can run amok and score in huge bursts if they're left unattended, but there's a lot of counterplay and ways to hinder their game plan that can feel suffocating. Not that the Keepers are weak per se, but they're just not as strong as other factions. So I'm ranking them 4 out of 10 for power level. I would also say the Badgers are unusually map dependent, and sometimes a bad roll of random clearings, for the winter map for example, can really be felt by the Badgers in a way that isn't as bad as other factions. All in all, the Badgers are another very healthy, fun, and complex faction that adds to Root's repertoire of militant factions. I never mind seeing them at my tables, and I feel like they are a clever puzzle that feels fresh and unique from all the other factions in the game. So yeah, they get 8 out of 10 for overall quality. I'm a fan of these buff Badgers. Okay, there we go. All of the factions, all of their stats, all of my takes, it's all here. So while you're here, let's talk about Root just for a couple minutes. The problem I have with Root is because the game is so dependent on what factions you play, that the game is actually kind of busted if you pick the wrong mix of factions. It just doesn't feel good to play. And it's a fundamental design flaw that a lot of other asymmetrical games don't suffer from. So the designers of Root put 2 different ways to solve this problem. The first is Reach, Reach is just saying how much a faction can influence a board. Cats are at the very tip because they have troops everywhere at the start, while our buddies the lizard cult are at the very bottom. So the big brains at Root HQ said, well, if you want an optimal match, you gotta play a mix of factions that give a certain amount of reach. For example, a game with the Otters, Corvid, Woodland Alliance, and Lizards would only go to 13 reach, while the game recommends at least 21 reach for 4 players. It's a little goofy. It's like, yeah, you want to play all these cool factions, but you gotta make sure there's enough action on the board, otherwise the game will be kind of boring and unplayable. So Root HQ took some fanspiration and went with what the competitive scene was doing as well, and that was a draft system. The draft system is called AdSet, or Advanced Setup. Advanced Setup is a draft set where you put one more faction in a pool than the amount of players. So in a 4-player game, there would be 5 factions. Of those factions, there is always at least one guaranteed militant faction. So you can't encounter the Otter, Lizard, Crow alliance game I mentioned. Also, if the last faction drafted is an insurgent faction, it is locked out until one of the militant factions is chosen. In other words, it guarantees at least one militant faction every single game. If this is confusing for you, that's fine. Just know it mostly fixes the issues around the game regarding composition and the faction choice. But you kind of have to dive into playing the competitive mindset to really experience a better way to play Root. And once you go AdSet, you really don't go back. Now, there is a third pseudo fix, which is the Hirelings, and Hirelings are little NPC buddies that change ownership across the game. And you know what? I rather like the Hirelings, but I feel like they play best at 2 and 3 player count to fill up a board. And they're definitely an upgrade from the use of the AI Clockwork factions, but I don't find them as a true fix to the optimal faction puzzle. More like a band-aid for lower player counts to fill up the board and create more moments. But yeah, a nice addition, they're fine for 2 and 3 player games. So yeah, Root has some tricks to address the inherent variance that's likely to occur when picking factions. And I'm a big fan of the advanced setup, so I use that almost every single game, and it creates a nice puzzle of how to draft and set up your factions even before the game begins. Diplomacy, or telling people what to do. Okay, one last thing I want to talk about in Root, and this bit is about the quarterbacking and kingmaking in Root. There's 2 issues that I have, and I just wanted to talk about them one more time before I stop talking about Root entirely. First, at a beginner level of play, whoever is the most experienced will almost have an obligation to help guide people through their factions and what their goals are. It's so common to play as your own faction, but also help new players with each step of their own faction. Because each turn is so involved and there's so many options, it's overwhelming trying to learn your own faction and 3 factions of your enemies simultaneously. So this form of quarterbacking is just a consequence that the initial complexity of Root demands. And Root really wants someone to teach and explain their faction, but a lot of the time it feels like quarterbacking for introductory games. Secondly, at the higher level, the game can devolve into a king-making domino. And let me propose a scenario. In this game state, you're playing as the Eyrie, and you're not doing so hot. You went into turmoil last round, and you're a little bit behind overall. But the Marquis de Cat, they're at 28 and are sitting on enough wood to bring them over the finish line. Likewise, the Corvid are at 26 and have one plot that they can flip over at their Birdsong to cross that line. So you have the choice. You can attack the cats at their sawmills and take out their wood, which would then stop them from making the very last building they need to squeeze out a win. On the other hand, you can go and attack the last unflipped plot that the Corvid need just to hold on to, otherwise they'll win as well. You have the key role, the God-ordained role as Kingmaker. You can truly decide what player wins with all the spite and favoritism that you decide to employ. There's nothing they can do at this moment except barter their case with you. And the thing is, this is all a part of the core design of Root. This is intended. Root wants to have a king, but also a kingmaker. At a higher level of play, a very interesting phenomenon happens. In our quest for fair play, people will kingslay the next player who could win. There's this domino effect. And let me go back to the example. If you're the Eyrie and after your turn it's the cats, and then after the cats it's the crows, it is your obligation to stop the cats. And then even if the cats can't win, it's their obligation to stop the crows. And then the crow's obligation to stop the next player. It's a domino effect of kingslaying. which is totally not enforced by the game, but happens naturally because players want to chase the idea of impartiality and fairness. It's this strange moment in Root where people come together to figure out and stop the next potential winner. Everyone looks at the board and works out this who is the real winner puzzle. And they do this communally, and they do it continually by kingslaying each other until the true victor is crowned. In other words, our innate sense of seeking fairness leads to this quarterbacking problem. And I'll say it again, players in Root will group up together at the end of the game and work out who is the true winner by doing this domino kingslaying routine until someone is revealed as that true winner. And yeah, it's not enforced by the game, but it's a trend that's in our own little psyche that wants to create a fair game even when the game isn't meant to be fair. And I know you might say, well dude, you're just wrong. You're playing the game wrong. Root isn't about kingmaking, you're just bad. And if you don't believe me, some dumb fool who didn't back the Kickstarter of Arcs, take it from the creator of the game.
A sort of central term, and that term for me is kingmaking. Because ultimately, Root is a game about kingmaking. I always have like a good laugh when I see a thread and someone's like, oh man, Root, I heard that it has a kingmaking problem. And I'm like, it doesn't have a kingmaking problem, it is the kingmaking problem.
So whether you like it or not, you need to face the truth. Kingmaking, kingslaying, the whole little thing, it's a central feature of Root, not a bug. Root is mean, but in our quest for a balanced and fair experience, people who are familiar with Root tend to default into kingslaying the next person to win, and will continue to do so until the true winner is crowned. This is the fairest way we can do it, which is actually counter to the design of Root itself. So let's do some final thoughts. What's the grand trick of Root? Well, beyond the fixes like the advanced setup, reach, the exiles and partisans deck, the rebalancing, even things like hirelings for lower player counts, the game has one big trick that is so obvious that it would be sinful not to discuss. The game is cute. That's it. That's the secret. The game penetrates the consciousness of non-gamers and casual gamers, and all the meanness and all the bickering, all the kingmaking, it's all protected because the game is cute. The theming of the game is the secret armor, shielding all the complexity, all the fiddliness, all the meanness, everything, all the spite, it's all protected by this perfectly crafted, cute vibe. And when I was reading up on the design of Root and listening to a couple design diaries, I think what stuck to me the most is what the designer said about what he called the dangerous game. And Cole references another book by Bernard de Koven, The Well-Played Game. And to quote de Koven and The Well-Played Game, our dangerous games can't involve those who haven't accepted the threat, who haven't chosen to play with us. We can't play dangerously with someone who isn't playing. It isn't play. And that's really what I wanted to leave off on. I think Root can be an excellent experience, but it is a dangerous game that is dressed in the skin of a light-hearted, family-friendly game. Root is a game where people can truly feel confused, mad, or even betrayed if they aren't aware of its innate meanness. In other words, for a good time, people need to accept the threat of Root before playing it, and acknowledge that it is a mean game. It's paradoxical because what people see is all this amazingly cute art, these fantastically adorable meeples, but underneath is a game that is complex, vindictive, and spiteful. It's important that people know what they're getting into when they sit around a game of Root, and because the design of Root is so centered around kingmaking and meanness, it can be a little strange seeing this game at Target for unsuspecting families to buy, expecting to buy Forest Time Summertime Adventure. For the designer's perspective, he sees the art as a way to soften the mechanics. By seeing the humor in the animals and the cuteness and the absurdity of it all, it distances the meanness of Root and makes it feel less intense. And I can understand that angle, but I don't fully feel convinced. Being cute doesn't absolve Root of being mean, but instead cloaks the meanness to be revealed as the game progresses. Root is unsuspectingly spiteful, and it can be a bait and switch if you aren't informed on what to expect. In other words, being cute doesn't mean that the meanness doesn't hurt, which is to say I slightly disagree with Cole. It's a grand trick of how a game can lure unsuspecting people into thinking it's fun and friendly until the family has to go to divorce court after a final in-game betrayal. So there's my thoughts. If I have to score Root and its major expansions, I'd give it a very solid 9.1 out of 10. But there are a lot of caveats in that score. It's not a simple pick up and play like so many other games, but a game that needs people who are down to get mean, who are down to go through all the faction drafting, who are really wanting to sit down and make some kings. The game quality changes dramatically on who you're playing with and who you're playing as. Plus, no Vagabond. Games with Vagabonds go down like 3 points. Anyways, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you again. And bye.